people just can't get up this early. A couple have to work, believe it or not. We'll be here a little later. Yeah, and that includes people that were at our event last night. So, you know, it was pretty warm in there. We got a cooler in here today, thank goodness, because we launched our complaint with the management. Anyways, we've got this room basically scheduled today from 9 to 5, and that's how long we have the room. That doesn't necessarily mean we're going to go that full length. It depends a lot on your response, what you want to get involved with in terms of issues, and it's going to be a two-way street, although I will begin the show and control it for the first part of the day, because I want to get a few basics, definitions, and fundamentals out of the way, so that we can all have a reasonable discussion about the issues later on in the day. And I think that's one of the places we're going to start. So generally, what I have in mind in terms of how we're going to break the day up, and I can't guarantee how long each of these sections is going to take, but generally I want to get first discussing principles, back to basics. We're talking definitions and concepts, some basics about politics, and some basics about economics. I think these are very important things to get out of the way so that we can all reasonably learn to understand politics better. And then after that section, we'll get into actually discussing policies and issues. What policies come out of these principles and these ideas that we're discussing? What issues do they relate to? And not only that, but how do we implement our policy? It's very nice to say, let's privatize this, let's do that, let's taxpayer direct it. How will that be done? I want to talk a little bit about that too. And we've got so many issues that are open to our discussion. I know a lot of you, if you look on the back of the flyer that was sent out in the mailer with this, we just thought of some of the basics that we get most of the questions about from people. And that's how we broke this down in terms of what people want to talk about. That's by no means meant to restrict any of your questions to these subjects. If there's anything else on your mind politically later on when we get question and answers going, please feel free to bring it up. Because, and we'll take a break every now and then to stretch our legs and have a coffee or whatever. So if I'm running like over an hour, 15 minutes at a time, let me know. And we'll take a break. Now, first of all, I think I should start by telling a little bit about myself. I don't pretend to have all the answers to every political question. I don't even pretend to have all the questions, although I think I've got a lot more than most people in my position you might find have to offer. But I do have 10 years of experience in politics with Freedom Party directly, actually a few more years than that, since I really got involved in politics in the late 70s, sort of inadvertently, not on any partisan level. My real history in terms of my profession is I'm an accountant by profession. I worked in the banking and the trust industry for 10 years before I got involved with this full time. This was my hobby during the last part of my 10 years with the trust company. I say hobby in the sense of my part-time activity. The next thing I knew, my part-time activity became my full-time activity. And I love doing what I do. I love working with Freedom Party. I love the people that I meet. I like expressing the ideas that I think need to be expressed. And all that despite the many sacrifices that I have to make, and that a lot of us who get involved in politics, as you all know, those of you that do, have to make when you get involved in a movement or something that you believe in and that you want to see succeed. So by no means do I have all the answers to every question in the world in terms of politics, but I think my experience is a little bit unique. There's nothing, I think, that is offered in an official education capacity in a university or college or anything like that in terms of the type of political courses that I would have in a university or college. I think when somebody tells me they've got a political science degree or they've taken politics in any sort of university or college course, I think we've got a trained socialist on our hands. And I honestly believe that, because I think that's what we're seeing coming out of our intellectual community. And that's one of the things we're going to talk a lot about today, is particularly socialism and capitalism, and we'll get into that once we get past a few other definitions, I think. Now again, think the place to start, I guess, a lot of people, you know, they try to wonder what is our political obstacle? Why can't we turn things around? They see all the symptoms of the problem. They see government spending. They see high taxes. They see runaway deficits. They see laws that just don't make sense. You know, don't you hear that more and more often? You know, the government's becoming a joke in a funny sort of way. Because it makes so many laws that don't make sense to the average, everyday individual who has a little bit of common sense. We're at the same time, you know, we got to face it. We still live in a country that is relatively free, in which we can exercise a great deal of freedom that is denied people in other countries. And I think we have to realize that some of the symptoms that we're complaining about are going to threaten that degree of freedom that we still have. You know, when people lose their freedom, it never happens overnight. It's a slow, gradual, deteriorating process that people do not notice as it is happening. Which brings me to my analogy that I once made in a fast copy of Freedom Flyer. I wrote an essay called Fascism and Frogs. And I don't know if you know about that experiment where they tell you if you put a frog in a bowl of, or in a kettle of water on a stove, and you raise the heat on that stove very slowly, that frog won't jump out of that water until the water almost reaches boiling and it's too late, he's dead. But if you were to turn up that water really quickly, within a matter of seconds, that frog would be jumping. See, in the same way we're in that environment the frog is in. It's getting warm, but it's kind of comfortably warm. You know, we kind of like our socialism. We like the benefits that we're getting. Things are getting hotter in terms of the political friction, in terms of the other issues that come around. So certainly I think we have to think about that frog in the pot when we talk about our awareness of how things are changing and how rapidly Canada is changing. I think that's one of the great things that impressed me most in William Trench's book, Only You Can Save Canada, is where in the beginning he describes the Canada of 1966. That's not so long ago. And then he compares it to the Canada of today. And there are so many subtleties he brings out in terms of how the fabric of our society has changed, not just economically and all the issues you hear, but things like back in 1966 they thought nothing of leaving newspapers open. They trusted people to place the money in the coin box. That was never a problem. Today you've got locks on it, special ignition switch, pull this, get that, and it's a symptom of how people are thinking in this country, and that's the problem. Our problem is not all the issues that we see around us. Those are symptoms of the problem. Our problem, and I mean when I say our, I mean ours collectively as a province or nation, is how we think about issues, our fundamental thinking. And not just the issues, but how we think about our fundamental freedoms. A lot of us have opinions about our freedoms that kind of denigrate our freedoms. Sometimes we think that, well, if we advocate freedom for ourselves, we're being selfish. I mean, we're always told that, aren't we? Ah, you're selfish. You're acting in self-interest. And this is supposed to be a bad thing. And when we talk about good and bad, we enter another area, morality, which is something we'll be getting to shortly. So that's what we're here to discuss today. We're going to be here basically to discuss some of the basics, how to think about issues. This is basically, I have to tell you, these are all things that I learned on my own. I didn't come by this through any formal process. I came through all of my basic experience through the School of Hard Knocks, as one of our members always like to call it. The world of reality out there, dealing in politics, dealing with other people of different beliefs, and how to approach them, how they think you sound when you're giving them your ideas. Those of you that were at the dinner last night, you got kind of impression of that when we played the all candidates debate. And you can see there's a very great degree of hostility to the ideas of freedom, because a lot of people know, or sense, that these ideas of freedom threaten the current type of security they have. And they're right. It does. And what they don't realize is that regardless of what we say about freedom, what we're doing now with socialism and deficits running at a rate like that, well, that's threatening their security now. And in a very real way, we're seeing it now collapse and fall apart. We're seeing privatization happen as a matter of necessity instead of a matter of logic and consistency and doing it properly in the first place. So unfortunately, we find ourselves in this position, and we are no worse or better than a lot of other countries in this regard. The the same things are happening in the United States. The same basic issues, the same basic principles are what every issue in every corner of this planet is all about. And that's one of the things I learned very early when I started self-teaching myself philosophy, particularly. Since the very beginning of time, basically, of our recorded history, all the issues have been the same. Never been any different. The basic philosophic issues are always the same. And yet people always talk about, oh, well, we're progressing on to new ideas. We're progressing on to this and that. But these fundamental issues stay the same. It's like the law of gravity. It doesn't change no matter what time, era, or anything you're in. So I think the first thing we'll have to do is get back to basics. Definitions, concepts, and a little bit about thinking. One of the first things we have to clear up is the whole idea of what is an ideal social system or political system or political party for that matter. And I think what really comes into a lot of debates unnecessarily, and it's one of the things you should watch out for right away, is a conflict between telling people about an ideal or giving them a system that's, quote, perfect. Because no system is perfect in the sense of what people may expect from it. And that's very important. I think capitalism, for example, is a perfect system because I've learned what it is by definition, by what it's supposed to be. And I don't expect capitalism to do things that it's not supposed to do. So therefore, I don't have a problem with that. But a lot of people would. And then you get into all kinds of debates on society itself being perfect. Certainly we can have a minimum number of laws and create a minimum government and create minimum crime, but we're still going to have crime. We're still going to have criminals. We're still going to have socialists among us. So, the thing is that we're not talking about perfection. We're talking about ideals. When Ayn Rand wrote her book, which influenced me very greatly when I got involved in politics, and I certainly recommend it to anyone. It's called Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, not the unknown perfection, or the perfect system, or the system without any problems, or the system without any social ills or hospital diseases. That's not what it's about. And we can't expect government to do these things. So we have to talk about ideals, not perfection. We have to admit that there are going to be problems in every society. Yes, you're going to have drug abuse. You're going to have problems in the family. These things go on. These are personal problems that people have in their everyday lives. So once we get that argument out of the way, you can often get around a lot of issues with people. So the next thing I want to discuss, and I'll just keep these words in front of you on the board, because this is the problem most people have with politics, I think. Many people who want to understand the issues, again, relate to the symptoms that they see. Unemployment, high taxes, deteriorating services. These are the concretes. These are the things that we can see. And so basically, that's one aspect of how we think and how we relate to reality, the concretes. But on the other scale, one thing that makes us different, for example, from the animals and from the, quote, lower thinking beings on this earth, is mankind's ability to think in terms of abstracts. Abstraction. So I'm going to put that here. I'm not going to get to it. The definition on this yet. I want to make a demonstration. Most people, I don't know what you think when you think of the word concrete. The concrete, here's a piece of concrete. Okay? If I show this to people in the crowd, you're not going to argue pretty much if I ask you what it was. You're not going to argue. You know, somebody might call it a stone, somebody might call it a rock, but basically, you're not going to mistake it for a table. You're not going to call this a widget or anything else. You know, this is a piece of stone or concrete. You can see it. You can relate to it. But that doesn't tell us anything about how this piece of concrete came to be. Was it natural? I mean, was this man-made? Do we know that? Do we know anything about the background of this piece of concrete? I don't think we do. It's just a piece of concrete. Now the word abstract, what's the word that the thing that most people really associate with the word abstract. And I think one of the things that I hear a lot of people tell me is art. Abstract art. You know, you go to an art gallery and you see abstract art. So I brought a couple samples, courtesy once again of my darling daughter Danielle, who got to do some art class work for school. And I guess I would call this abstract art. Now, if I were to ask some of you around the room what you think this is, or what it does for you, just give me a couple of suggestions. But what do you see when you look at it? Except for the couple of you that know what it is.
It's the urban struggle of the proletariat.
I know mess.
Okay.
Man's inhumanity to man. That's what
It's the environmental garbage dump thing, whatever. Could be anything.
Is that what you saw?
No, I saw preschool craft.
Variations.
Well, maybe what we should do is determine what the artist had in mind when she did this. The title of this piece is called Junkie's Dream. Can you see what's in that?
How do you spell junkie?
Does it make sense as a piece of abstract art in terms of Junkie's Dream? You see some matches, some cellophane, this and that, you know, kind of things that somebody who quote might be a junkie would have around. Where'd you get all this stuff? But, you know, once it's explained to people, a lot of people can relate to it. Yeah, that's what it is. You know, that's what that abstract is. Here's another one. What do you think when you see this? Abstract art. What do you?
It's the
Confusion.
Confusion.
That's something biological.
yes.
It might be.
To the
You know, Danielle titled this one Pleasure, just to evoke a feeling of pleasure.
The phallic symbol right
It could look like is that what you got on your mind?
sex organs of the universe.
Now here's another one. This is the last one I'm going to show you. What do you kind of see when you see that? Three.
Big brain.
Big brain.
Could be veins,
Crystals.
Veins. Crystals. Wow. You know,
rivers.
it kind of, I like all of these because this is a little bit different from the reaction we got to the other ones because it's much closer to what it is. Danielle calls this one the lattice of life. And when she submitted it, she wrote a little description of what she means by it. I have that here. The lattice of life represents the human ability to adapt, to flourish in any circumstance. It is continually growing, stretching outward, striving to become more than it is. We've come so far, learned so much, and yet still have so much more to learn and do. It is the challenge we thrive on, the choices we make, the direction we head. If you destroy one limb, you irreparably damage the whole, but we have the ability to heal ourselves, to grow something new, to replace the old, to overcome our tragedies, our limitations. The lattice of life represents the will of the individual.
Heavy.
You know, when I read that, I said, gee, that's pretty good, but that's when I started looking at this picture that way. I didn't look at it from my own perspective afterwards. So I guess the point that I'm trying to make is when we talk about politics, and we talk about, you see, the whole world of politics is in abstracts. You can't see a capitalism sitting on the floor. You won't find a socialism down there. Do you understand what I'm getting at? That everything in politics is abstract. And that's why when we use words in common, and you use the word socialism and I use the word socialism, but you're thinking Junkie's Dream and I'm thinking something else, we obviously cannot communicate. We are unable to communicate because we're not using the same language. This is one of the first things I read. This is why I admire particularly Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand is almost in a way less a philosopher than a definer. She made it very clear how important definitions were, how clear we have to be in terms of abstractions, because everything under abstractions is what we're talking about today. So we've got to be clear about what we mean when we say socialism. What do we mean when we say capitalism? What do we mean when we say any of the issues? You know, even words like philosophy, principles, morality, choice, justice, law, group rights, property rights, individual rights, all these things are just concepts that mean
Human rights.
definition. Human rights, yes. Good morning, David. Come on in and sit down. So you can see the problem that we face in politics and why there's so much confusion in politics. In fact, that's one of the reasons we are regressing socially. Ayn Rand made a fascinating point. You know, everybody kind of comments and remarks. You hear this comment from time to time. Isn't it remarkable how science advances, science and technology and mathematics advance right now on an exponential scale that we can hardly comprehend? It's like the national deficit here. That's science and technology. But on the other hand, socially we are regressing. And Ayn Rand was the first person that I've ever encountered to point out the reason is definitions. The reason that science advances is because it uses precise language consistently. It does not today say that the number 2, which has this value, means this tomorrow, which is what we do in politics. Today, socialism may mean this, tomorrow it means this. But the guy you're talking to tomorrow is still thinking this. So you can't communicate. There's no advancement. In fact, things fall apart because people are not communicating. Language is much more than just our means of communication. It is, in fact, our means of thinking. There was a great article in the Toronto Star a couple of weeks ago, I think it was 2 weeks ago. I have a book from it right here. Discussing the amazing brain. It was a tremendous article. It was brought to my attention by a couple of people. I just photocopied a section of it. It was actually 3 full pages long. They gave a lot of information. They're really doing a lot of research on how the brain works and how we think and how we reason. And what's really amazing is that now science is showing us and telling us the things that I've been reading in Ayn Rand's philosophy that she wrote 50 years ago. And basically, they're just listen to this quote here. The ability to form abstract thoughts, for instance, is now seen as a consequence of the brain's ability to read. 1,000 years ago, in medieval England, most people did not think abstractly, says Dr. Bruce Berry, who was a neuroscientist at the University of Chicago. The majority of people viewed the world very concretely. When we look back now and think about how superstitious they were about a lot of things, they say that it's the same way that an 8 or 9-year-old children may think about things and view the world in a very simplistic way. So what they're actually saying is that our ability to think and to advance came when we began first to read so that we can conceptualize our ideas as single codes. Now, just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, this book, Capitalism is a single word. This book, Capitalism, Ayn Rand wrote to define it. That's all it is. She sets out in the beginning, she says, I'm not here to trumpet the cause for capitalism or, you know, say up with the rich and down with the poor or do any of that stuff. She says, I'm just going to define this for you. And she came from a communist country. She knows what the opposite is. And she says, once I've defined it for you, how can you possibly defend any other kind of system? So you can imagine the task we face when we have to go to people in the marketplace or talk about people about capitalism, that this is what it means, essentially. But we can't go and say all this. Capitalism is a system of private property, free markets, free enterprise, you know, and go through the whole definition every single time we want to discuss this concept with people. So that's why we have words to hold those concepts. And they're very real concepts. Just because it's an abstract thought does not mean it is not real. It is very real. You know, the one abstract thought, one way of abstract thinking, I should have mentioned this when I talked about the science thing, numbers, for example, are abstracts. And yet they're very real. Absolutely real. You know that when you look at the numbers in your bank account. You know that when you look at the numbers of the deficit. You know that when you look at the numbers of any calculation. I mean, they're very real things, and yet you will not see a concrete 2 sitting on the ground, or a concrete 956. But we understand what that represents because we understand the concept behind that. So this is where we have to be very consistent with our definitions. Now it's interesting, I was looking at of all things, an economics textbook, just to again stress this point on abstractions. And abstractions are very important to human beings. It's remarkable. I found this particular thing, this basic concept in an economics text. But it's interesting what it says, why we have to be able to abstract. What are the reasons we have to be able to think this way, why we have to think above the basic concretes and what we just see. And basically, what they say is that all and analysis, if you want to understand something, okay, if you want to understand something, you have to be able to abstract. Because no mind can apprehend a whole bundle of unrelated facts. In fact, when they do studies on the human brain, in terms of how many things you can concentrate or consciously concentrate on at one single time, the average person runs at around 2 to 4. A very intelligent person is maybe 5 or 6, and sort of 5 or 6 things in their mind pretty concurrently at once. And you would think with all the knowledge in our brains and everything that we can hold up here in terms of knowledge that there would be a lot more than that going on, but it's not true. You can only hold certain very single concepts and a very limited number of them at one time. For example, I know I have a problem. I play musical instruments. When I'm playing a musical instrument, I just envy musicians who can sing and play at the same time. I can't do it. I can sit down at a piano or pick up a guitar, and if somebody wants to talk to me or interrupt me or even say anything, you know, I've lost my way. I can't concentrate on that. Yet I am capable of talking and I am capable of playing that instrument, but I can't do both at the same time. So we have to be able to abstract all these things so we can tie them together. You know, a lot of people say, well, you can figure things out if you get more facts. But the fact is, all the facts and the data in the world, you know, it would still be necessary to abstract. And this is what is done in every science. And abstraction involves simplifying things. To take a basic concept or a principle out of a whole mass of detail and specific concretes so that we can analyze it and understand it. Now, it's interesting what this textbook says further on, and here comes that word idealism again. It always says that it is always necessary to idealize, to omit detail, to set up patterns by which the facts can be related, so that we can set up the right questions before going out to look at the world as it is. I think that's very important. We can go out and look at the world, but if we're not asking the right questions, we're certainly not going to come back with the right answer. But it's also important to keep yourself reminded of this, and this they warn us again of. In every theory, whether in the physical, biological, or social sciences, every theory, whether physical, biological, or social, distorts reality a little bit in the sense that it oversimplifies. This is sometimes where we get into a lot of problems when we state a basic principle. It may be an oversimplification of a particular instance, and that may be the case. But that does not invalidate the principle as such. We have to know how to relate that principle to the specific instance. But if it's a good theory, what is omitted in detail is far outweighed by the beam of illumination that results in understanding the data. And of course, the ultimate test of a theory's validity is its usefulness in illuminating observed reality, which means concretes. We go back to the concretes. We have to test our abstract ideas against the concretes. We have to see if we're saying something abstract in one place applies consistently, or if there are major changes somewhere in terms of the concretes. If there are, maybe there's something wrong with the way we're thinking, and we have to reevaluate our basic abstractions or definitions. So it's very important to basically summarize, again, language, of course we use it to communicate. But unless we agree to common terms, communication, trade, and exchange of ideas is impossible. More importantly, we use abstractions and definitions to think. Language is a tool of thinking, relating concepts, which become words, and those words relate to sounds. This is one of the reasons we got very heavily involved with the issue of whole language. In the way they're teaching right now in the public schools our kids how to read and write. And we were criticized by some members saying you shouldn't be criticizing specific methods in the school or specific philosophies because your party stands for freedom of choice. If people want to learn whole language or learn by whole language, by gosh, why can't they? Well, we don't object to that. They can. What we object to is that from our fundamental understanding of whole language and the philosophies and principles on which it's based, it's counter to everything we understand about concepts, about abstractions, about drawing abstractions to concretes. So it's very important that we learn these things early. And of course, the final thing about definitions and abstractions is that that is how the human race stores knowledge. It's literally how we record our history. Everything we know is recorded through these definitions and words, books. Not like a computer that can just store a given amount of knowledge on a hard disk, but an infinite amount of knowledge. We store all our knowledge on written word in the form of language, and certainly advancement of knowledge is not possible without clear definitions. Humanities versus science, language, revision. So these are the things that we're going to get into next. How are we doing timeline? And I thought we'd get into some definitions now. Which means, oops, where's my concrete?
Where did you get that book?
I don't know, it's grabbed out of the backyard and
Just watch the pothole on the way out.
So when I got involved in politics initially, that was one of the first obstacles I ran into. I found out that when I was out there debating issues, I was using Ayn Rand's language because that's what I learned from. But everybody else was using a slightly different language in terms of describing the same thing. So what we've been working at for quite a while, and still haven't completed down at Freedom Party offices, is we have been working towards actually creating a political dictionary. A dictionary of quite a different sort in the sense that the definitions will go a little bit beyond what you would get in a standard dictionary, because believe it or not, a lot of these abstractions, particularly in politics and philosophy, have slightly different definitions depending on the dictionary that you pick up. I was surprised at this. I thought there'd be a lot more consistency, and then you start seeing how little consistency there is. So to give you an example, what we did, our approach to this was we picked about 4 or 5 dictionaries. And we're still in the process of doing this. And then we would pick a whole list of words that would relate to politics in general. I'll just give you an example of some of the words, like these are sort of in alphabetical order, but anarchism, anarchy, bourgeois, bourgeoisie, capitalism, collectivism, communism, conservative, democracy, dictatorship, fascism, free, freedom, free enterprise, government, individual, individualism, laissez-faire, left-wing, liberal, libertarian, liberty, mixed economy, progressive, proletariat, radical, reactionary, right, right-wing, socialism, state, statism, and more. So I mean, you can go on with definitions, but those are some of the fundamentals. And so what we were doing was starting to relate definitions. What we would do is put one sheet for each word and list each of our sources differently and put the different definitions from the various different dictionaries to the same word. And then we put our last word on it later to clear up the definitions and point out the distinctions. And this is the thing we have to get into about definitions, and that's the word distinctions. The reason we define words and have different words for things is so that you can distinguish things from one another. But if the definitions between certain concepts are blurred, we can't distinguish. For example, one of the most interesting definitions, and socialists hate this when you bring this up, is that if you look in any, or most dictionaries, not all of them, and you look at the word socialism and the word communism, they both mean exactly the same thing. I have one dictionary that has precisely the same definition under socialism and communism. And yet, socialists will defend to the hill, oh no, we're not communists, we don't think that radical, we're not that radical, we believe still in democracy and freedom and all those types of things. But it's not true. You can't get those results with those abstract ideas. They don't fit. That's the round peg going into the square hole, as someone mentioned last night. And that's essentially what a lot of people are doing. And now I discovered all these things, through experience again. I mean, I voted NDP before. I confess that to all of you right now. I voted conservative. I voted liberal. And then I quit voting. Before I got involved this way politically, I wasn't even voting anymore. I was apolitical, I thought. Little did I know by not voting or supporting it because that's how it's set up. That's how the whole system is set up. They count on that mass of voters who don't vote. So anyways, I thought what we would do is pick out a list of these words and some of these definitions and go through some of the key definitions and talk about the distinctions that are necessary on them and lead up basically. Right now I want to stick to the basic area of politics before we get into economics, social policy, and things like that, because that's where we're going to start from. And if we get into the issue of definitions on this level, and we can talk about how they're popularly understood, how dictionaries understand them, and maybe what the problem is with the distinctions of some of these definitions. So let's start with a couple here. Oh, and of course I want to lead up then the two key definitions that I'm going to concentrate on are going to be socialism and capitalism. And then when we get to those definitions, we'll take a little break so we can set up a tape for you here. I want to show you a bit of a debate on that very issue, socialism versus capitalism, perhaps on different terms than you may be familiar with. We're just going to show you some clips from how each side argues its point. And then maybe we can discuss a little bit about that. Now, from time to time, we at Freedom Party get accused of being anarchists. Anarchy. We stand for anarchy. Anything that's less government, I found out when I first got involved with this, even if you're talking about lowering taxes by 5 cents, oh, you're an anarchist. You have to, I didn't know how to deal with that word. You know, I'm not an anarchist. I believe in government. I think that the purpose of a government is to protect the individual's freedom of choice. How is that making an anarchist? But anarchy, here's a couple definitions. The basic sources we used, among others, were Webster's New 20th Century Dictionary, Collins' Pocket English Dictionary, the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, and a couple others. And I'm not going to get into which one said which, but just give you some of the definitions that we get. For example, anarchy, the theory that all forms of government interfere with individual liberty. Well, that may be true in a sense that forms of government interfere not so much with liberty, not if it's defined properly. See, this is where we have to, all the definitions start tying together. We've got to start looking at the definition of liberty. Another definition for anarchism is resistance, sometimes by terrorism, to government, or the theory that all government is unnecessary and undesirable. Also related to the words anarchy, and you find this in the dictionary, is political disorder and violence. You call an anarchist, you know, violence is involved, and yet socialist, you know, there's no socialist violence, there's no fascist violence. Anarchy, the complete absence of government. Anarchy, the disorder in any sphere of activity. Now, I have to make it clear, you see, some of these definitions may be okay if you're using them in the proper context. I mean, a lot of us understand the word anarchism in a sense of meaning disorder because we've been brought up with that. Oh, it's kind of anarchistic. And I guess to some degree we can accept that, but we cannot accept it when we go into the political realm. Because there anarchy has a very distinct definition. And generally, anarchy basically means no government at all, no government at all, and is predicated on the idea, I think that anarchy at its best, as a quote ideal, is a nice social system, and I can sympathize with it. You know, everybody talks about it would be the ideal system where all transactions are voluntary, no coercion exists between individuals, and therefore government is not necessary type of thing. I don't think that as a system, it's not a system. It may be an ideal social thing, but not a political system. Yes, certainly relationships should be voluntary. But anarchy generally means no government, and that's generally how I use the word. I mean, no instrument of government, no instrument of recourse, no instrument of law, no instrument of authority to protect our rights. A couple of other words. Collectivism. Socialism is a form of collectivism. basically, any system that's called collective means the ownership and control of the means of production and distribution, and I like this, by the people as a whole. And then they put in brackets socialism. You see, that may be a semi-accurate definition, but when you say the people as a whole, what does that mean? How do the people as a whole own and produce everything? Well, they can't. The mechanism is government. So what it really means, and this is where definitions in a dictionary can be very inaccurate, is distribution by the government. It doesn't mean by the people as a whole. That's just the justification the government uses. We're doing it for everyone's for everyone's welfare.
Dictatorship.
That's right. Again, you see another definition: ownership and control of the means of production and distribution by the people collectively. A political or economic theory advocating collective control, especially over production and distribution. But basically, when they talk collective control, whenever you're talking about collective rights, and this is one of the big debates that was going on in the last constitutional debate with the Charlestown Court, politicians wanted to see more collective rights in Canada and fewer individual rights. But the problem is, name me a collective right that you have, that you as an individual can exercise. It doesn't work that way. Only politicians can exercise collective rights. They're the only ones with the power to do it. And by calling it a collective right, calling their power a collective right, they get the public's moral support. Well, they're doing it for us. When in fact we have no rights in the matter. When it's a collective right, literally our rights are taken away, handed to the politician, he exercises it on our behalf, supposedly. That's what we're told. So that's one of the reasons we have to be very careful about the definition, or anything to do with collective rights. Individual rights, incidentally, are the only kind of rights that exist. And individual rights fundamentally relate to basic fundamental freedoms, and we'll be getting into that when we get into capitalism and socialism. Conservative. Interesting. Tending to preserve established institutions and to resist any change. Designating or of the major right-wing political party of Great Britain or Canada. Here's another definition. Moderate, cautious, safe. Or a member of a conservative party. Or one who adheres to traditional methods or views. Of course, that doesn't define the methods or views, though. What's the tradition of the day? Slavery? Well, I'm a conservative. What's the tradition of the day? Freedom? Well, then I'm a conservative too. You know, I always get reactions from people who are listening to what's happening in the Soviet Union, and they can't figure out, how come the communists are the conservatives?
Well, that makes the NDP here conservatives.
In a way, yes. Because they're the ones who want to preserve the tradition. So they're being called conservatives. And therefore, when we're talking conservative in the Soviet Union, that's a different world over there. That doesn't mean conservative what conservative would mean over here. Yes, Gordon?
I was just going to say, they also call it right-wing.
Yes.
The right-wing reactionaries are really the hardline left-wingers.
Exactly.
Of yesteryear.
And it seems funny the media is defining the terms for us in such a silly way that they don't mean anything.
That's right. And they use the words constantly as though, hey, it's all right. You know? So it doesn't matter. I mean, you can see this kind of thinking without definitions in any day's newspaper, especially this weekend's paper. Anybody saw London Free Press this weekend? Oh boy. Anyway, here's a big one. We had a whole dinner event and a special event on this definition. One definition. The word is democracy. Boy, there's more misconceptions about democracy than any other word that I can think of politically. People, you know, have this almost religious fervor about democracy, and yet so few of them understand what it is or what it means to them.
Why would NDP use Democrats?
Oh, very good question. What does what do they mean by the word new democracy? I'm going to be getting to that. But let's see what the dictionary says democracy is, and let's work from there. Government by the people, either directly or through elected representatives. Rule by the rule. A country, state, community, etc. is such a government. Here's one for you, majority rule. The acceptance and practice of the principle of equality of rights, opportunity, and treatment. Government by the people directly or through elected representatives. I'm reading from another dictionary, so some of them sound a little the same. I'm just going to see if there's difference here. Government by the people, especially rule of the majority. A government in which the supreme power is held by the people. Or the absence of hereditary or arbitrary class distinctions or privileges. Now, in all these definitions of democracy, I could say that, well, yeah, some of these things are elements of democracy. But by themselves, they do not stand as a definition of democracy. And this is where we get into a big problem. You know, I learned about democracy the hard way. I live in a democracy, and I've never been represented, ever, in my democracy. Every time I voted for anybody, when I voted for the other parties, I always voted for the loser. And since then, I didn't vote, or for that period in between, and then now I'm doing this, and we haven't been elected yet as Freedom Party. So basically, for me and my beliefs, I've never been represented in this democracy, and yet I'm supposed to be treated equally and have the same important right to my beliefs as any other individual, and yet that is not what happens. So people get really confused about the whole thing of democracy. We did a special issue of Consent magazine a while ago. I don't know if some of you might have seen it. It was a very thick magazine that we did on, it was called Can We Survive Democracy? I think I have a copy of it here. And the cover of that magazine, we printed a great cartoon that I think epitomizes very much of what democracy has become because of the NDP's definition of democracy. And that's basically, you know, let's see if you can see this cartoon here, right there. Gimme, 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 that's what it basically is. You know, all the people being out underneath, that's what that is, democracy. And isn't that exactly what was going on at the alternatives debate that we played last night at the dinner? Everyone in the audience was saying, give me, give me, give me, give me. And that's what democracy means to them. And basically, democracy never meant these things. It never did in the first place. A proper democracy is a democracy that's limited. Because, yes, we have to have majority rule in terms of the mechanics by which we elect people or elect our representatives. But there are certain things those representatives shouldn't be allowed to do. And that's where we get into the issue of fundamental freedoms. Because there are free democracies, and there are very state-controlled democracies, and yet they're both democracies. You know, officially, the Soviet Union is a democracy. In their constitution, they are a democracy. The problem is you can only vote for one party.
But you can get shot overnight if you
or you can do
say
that.
something against.
So really, you know, I used to ask the same question that Mr. Elliott did when I first heard the name the New Democratic Party. I'm going, New Democratic, what's wrong with the old democracy? What are they changing? And basically what they have done is gone from a democracy that believes in our fundamental freedoms and rights as sacrosanct. In other words, property rights, for example. You have your private property or to your home. The government's job is to make sure that that home stays your property as long as you live up to your natural and moral obligations to that property.
To protect it.
Yes.
To the police officer, not to
Exactly. And that you have protection from your neighbors and from politicians and from anyone else who wants to make a claim on your property. So that's basically the kind of protection you have to have in a democracy. See, when I rethought my thinking about what I go to the polls for. I'm not going to the polls to vote for a candidate to represent my interests. I want to go to the polls for a candidate and vote for a candidate that will represent my rights. There's a big difference between rights and interests, and I think too many people are using government and democracy, the system of democracy, to see to their interests, and not to protect their rights, which is what they need to pursue their own interests carefully. So with the New Democratic Party, basically, and this is the irony of it, what they mean by the new democracy is simply majority rule. And once you've got majority rule, once most of the people vote and said this, they can, you know, the government can do what it wants. And that's how they operate. The irony is that the way our political system works is that what we're calling majority rule is really a minority of people controlling the whole government. Because, number one, a lot of people don't vote. We know how the vote splits. A lot of Conservatives got votes, Freedom Party got a lot of votes, the NDP, or the Liberals got votes, but the NDP happened to get the most last election of all the other parties. But if you took all the votes of all the other parties and combined them, they really outnumbered the NDP greatly. So here we have a majority government in the province of Ontario that a minority of the people voted for, and yet we're still using the word majority. So you see how confused the whole world of politics is. Another interesting definition that we'll be getting into a little bit later, I'm just going to skip it for now, and that's fascism, because I honestly think that what we're seeing happen in Ontario today is less socialism and more fascism, but we'll get into definitions of that a little bit later. In fact, I think now would be a good time to take a break. I've been going for an hour. Everyone wants to just stretch, have a coffee. I'm going to get the videotape set up, and we'll get into the word socialism and capitalism. And then I want to show you a brief debate on how these issues are debated on different terms. So let's take a break for 5 minutes. Yeah. And I'll get this hooked up, and we can get it.
More active, more, more outgoing, and more competition to start a conversation on the streets with that.
I want to get into the basic argument today. There's one definition we have to cover first, of course, before we get into the debate between socialism and capitalism and which is a better system, And that definition is the definition of government. Because I think the central to everything we're talking about is the government. We have to have a pretty clear view of what we think of as government. And I went through my life for the longest time acknowledging certain realities about government that I assumed were a given. But until I read, and again it was Ayn Rand who influenced me in this regard, what her definition of government was and what its distinction was in society, well, that just set a series of dominoes rolling for me that cleared everything up. And basically, and I'm using this symbolically, not to frighten anyone, please, this is government. Government is a gun. Government holds an institutionalized monopoly on the use of force in society. Now, I always knew this about government. I knew government ended up here at some point. If you don't obey the law, or you don't cooperate, or you don't even go to jail, this is what's going to be ultimately used against you if you do not cooperate with the government. So this is basically what government is. And whenever I think, personally, about what I want to use government for, I think of this. And there are some legitimate uses for this. Self-defense. Somebody was going to, if there wasn't a government, let's say, and I owned a certain piece of property that I've taken care of and somebody wanted to take it from me, I'd probably resort to this to defend myself. And this can apply to any given number of situations, relationships, contracts, you name it. This is what ultimately enforces them. And that's one of the reasons we need governments, so that each of us doesn't have to walk around with one of these. This is basically a toy gun, but there are real ones out there. And that's basically what government is, if you really think about it. It's the final arbiter. That's the final authority. And we do need that in society. We need governments to settle our own disputes so that we're not shooting each other with one of these. Now, while that may seem self-evident, and I thought it was too, all my life I accepted that. I worked in the banking industry. I knew that, boy, if we didn't pay those taxes, we'd be in trouble. And I knew, boy, that if we didn't comply with these statutes or this law or that bylaw, that there would be repercussions. But it never occurred to me that really that's why the government is able to do it. So we're talking about the use of force, and we're talking about how to use force. And this is where we have to make another distinction. And that's distinguishing between the use of force as self-defense or the use of force as an offense. In other words, the initiation of the use of force. And essentially, there we come down to a moral question. And this is where morality enters the picture. Ayn Rand always said, morality ends at the point of a gun. Because after that, you haven't got a choice anymore. a lot of people talking about, you know, our moral society. The more freedom we have, the more immoral we're getting. People use drugs, people watch pornography, people do all sorts of things that are not socially acceptable to a lot of people. So we have to do something about it. So what do we do as a society? Yeah, we do the right thing. We get the gun out. We go tell our neighbors what to do.
Well, it is. Hey, we're in a police state.
In many senses. But the thing that's happening today is that the government isn't using that gun to defend individuals' rights anymore on their behalf. It's going out to violate the right. It's initiating the gun. Nobody asked anybody to pick the gun up. The government's doing this all by itself. This gun is running loose. And that's the problem we're seeing today. All of our relationships in our society are becoming forced. Forced by equity. Forced official bilingualism. You know, forced anything. I mean, anything the government does, that's really the only tool it has. That's all it is. And you know, when people ask you a question, well, why can't government run like a business? Well, that's why. It's so fundamental. If you understand that, you wouldn't ask that question. Why governments can't run like a business?
Yeah,
Because they do not have to earn their money voluntarily. They do not have to persuade the people to give their money to them for their service. They have to force them. So, government cannot be a business. It cannot operate on the principles of a business. A business operates on a private market with private property, through private investment, private risk. And above all, the business community has to earn its keep. If we as customers don't go to the business community or buy products to the business community, well, that guy's got to change his line of business. And that's how the market economy works. We don't go around using guns to keep people in business. The same thing happens socially. Our welfare system is basically the same thing. Now, I always remark that governments really should not be able to do what we as individuals cannot do on our own. The idea of a government in a free democracy is that it governs with the consent of the governed. And I stress this word govern as opposed to rule. The difference between ruling and governing. Ruling is telling people what to do, predetermining their decisions in areas that do not violate rights. Remember, this is the thing we've got to talk about is rights. We all have certain individual rights, and as long as we don't violate each other's individual rights, within that context, we should be free to do, quote, what we want, which of course doesn't mean that we can do what we want. And this is one of the big misunderstandings about rights and freedom, too, as they relate to government. One of the big problems we have with the word freedom is, in one dictionary I looked under, believe it or not, there were 50 definitions of freedom. And all of them were fairly accurate within their own context. There were free froms and free tos. You can be free from something, free from disease, free from debt. Different kind of application of the word freedom. Perfectly legitimate as a social use, but it's not what we're talking about when we're talking about freedom as a political concept. Freedom as a political concept is something very different. And because we are citizens supposedly in a free society, our government can only govern with our consent. And since we all possess certain rights, and our government is exercising its defense of those rights, it can't have rights that we don't have. That just doesn't make sense. It's a contradiction. You know, this is where governments try to argue for group rights, to create rights for government that individuals don't have. And this is where you get into problems with things like official bilingualism. They create a group, French, give the French a particular right. Quote, to call it a right. It's not a right if everyone else doesn't have that same right. Because that's one of the main things that a right has to be. It has to be equal to everyone. And, you know, we talk about freedom and rights, and we always get accused, those of us who advocate freedom and rights, of wanting people to be able to do whatever they please, and that's simply not what freedom is. In fact, I'd like to get you a lot more to think in freedom in a little different terms, in terms of being actually a limit on what we can do. Because the proper definition of freedom is not do whatever you can do. It's do what you can do with your own life, your own property, your own choices, to the extent that you do not interfere with other people's freedom. There's the limit. And that's why property rights are so important to a free society. We have to set lines between us so that we can agree to disagree. You know, in a free society, everyone has the right to disagree with one another. We don't all have to buy the same color shoes. We don't have to all believe the same things. But just because we're different, we don't have to be on each other's neck about our differences. We don't have to be in conflict. And it's those kind of conflicts that the government loves to create. Why is that? Well, because this is the government. And how do you settle a conflict? Well, it's done. If you haven't got a conflict, well, what use is this? So you have to create a lot of conflict so you can get out there and show one side or the other that you're doing something for them. And so basically, we have to think of freedom not always in terms of what we can do and the limit of our actions, but in terms of the limits it actually places on each of us. You've heard that saying, your freedom ends where my nose begins, or something like that. That old saying. It's true. It's a basic application. Only through the abstract concept of property rights, we can extend our noses to the front lawn of our house, or the back lawn of our house, because that's our private property that is the result of our labor, our own work, and is part of us, in essence, while we're on this planet. And so that same principle applies. So certainly we have to work with the definition of government within that context. You know, when it comes to the social issues for government, you know, again, the same principle applies. I always tell people that my sign of a good government is a government that can't do something that I can't do. And I give them an example. I can say, for example, in a welfare situation. Let's say, as a neighbor, I look across the street and there's a neighbor of mine who's in distress, just lost his job or something like this. Well, I have all the freedom, and so do all my other neighbors, to help that individual. We can give them our assistance. We can, you know, help them pay the rent, give them some food for groceries if that's what that person needs. But I do not have a right to pick up a gun. And I see Charlie down there who's got problems, and I go over down here to Bill's place and knock on his door and say, Bill, Charlie's in trouble. He needs your help. Hand it over. Because literally, that's what government is doing when we institute government welfare. It's forced welfare. We're forcing a certain percentage of the Canadian population to hand their money over to be transferred to someone else. And this first started on the premise of helping the poor, helping that disadvantaged person. But once that process got going, suddenly there were other people who were in need. They weren't necessarily poor, but there was that business guy that needed a loan. There was that big corporation that had a problem. They need a loan too. Let's bail them out. Well, this means a lot of jobs. And on the process goes until we're not even doing it to, quote, help the poor anymore. And that's why we have universal social programs. They're not programs targeted towards people who need help. They're for everybody. Everybody pointing the gun at everybody, and then we all wonder why we're getting angry with each other and getting a little bit irritable and a little bit poorer in the process. So if I can't go to my next door neighbor and point a gun in his head and tell him he has to do this, my impression is that my government cannot either, since my government represents my rights, and I don't have the right to do that. So how can I tell my government to do it? Isn't that just the same as hiring a hired gun? But only this time we make it illegal. And this is difficult for a lot of people to accept, especially people, you know, who, quote, have a heart. This is where we're going to get at the issue of socialism. You know, people too often identify socialism with its intended results, with what people say socialism is going to do for them, rather than what the results actually are, and rather than what socialism actually is. Socialism is constantly judged in terms of that, that pie-in-the-sky goal that the socialists keep pushing to us, that society of absolute equality. Nobody has to work hard for a living. Everyone's guaranteed a minimum income, and we just don't have to worry about sustaining our own lives. I mean, if we thought about that for a minute, we should know that doesn't make sense. I mean, if I'm not worrying about sustaining my life, well, who is? You? Hey, wait a minute, we're in a socialist society. And if you're not worried about sustaining your life, somebody else has to take care of you. Who's that? How often does this process go on? Is it any wonder that the government takes more than half of our income in taxes? And that's the part we can measure. I'm sure we lose a lot more in non-monetary terms in terms of our potential for income and our potential for a higher standard of living. So socialism always gets defined in terms of its goals. Capitalism tends to get defined in terms of its results. And ironically, people are hating the results of capitalism. You know, we wrote a pamphlet, one of our pamphlets called Socialism and the War on Wealth. And there's a tremendous war on wealth going on in this country. And it has gone on in every socialist country. And we see it coming in all sorts of ways. First of all, our taxes, just what we saw with the Fair Tax Committee. You know, they're always talking about the ability to pay. Well, the ability to pay is the people who have the money. And the fewer of them, they keep going up the scale or down the scale. Whoever's got the money is the person who has the ability to pay. So, it's funny, you know how they talk about this, some people have, quote, excess wealth in a capitalist society. See, even that word capitalism is a little bit too narrowly defined, because all it does is define an economic element of a larger system. Capitalism isn't just an economic system, but it's always being defined as such. It's a larger system than that, it's a social system. It's a whole theory of values and a theory of principles that underlie capitalism, of which it is part. It's not simply capitalism. You see, this was defined, capitalism has always been defined by its enemies, and never by its friends, and never by the people who understand it. And these are the definitions that our kids are growing up with. It's the definitions I grew up with. I thought, oh, capitalism, selfish, dirty capitalist, greedy pigs. I mean, have you ever heard that statement? Capitalist pig, eh? Another thing you hear about capitalism a lot is that the business community, they're all capitalists, right? Anybody in business is a capitalist. He's out for himself. I got news for you. The business community is not capitalist. The business community is social. I have talked to the business community. I've talked to members of the business community, and they believe a lot of things in socialism. And yet, socialism hates their cats. And yet they support socialism. Because they have this feeling of empathy for people in distress, and they think socialism is going to address them. They think that socialism, because of its promise, not because of what it is and what it does, but because of its promise, a promise that, by the way, has never ever been delivered on. This is what they relate to. And yes, I mean, wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have to work for a living? Wouldn't it be nice if everybody was equal and we all had all the color TVs in our house we wanted, and the saunas and swimming pools, and none of us had to worry about where any of that came from? I mean, that would be nice. I agree. It would be a nice feeling, but that's not the way the world works. We're in a world of reality, and you know, this is another thing that happens when you talk about capitalism. You get accused of being just the law of the jungle. The law of the jungle. The weaker ones are devoured by the stronger ones.
Survival of the fittest.
Right. Well, this is not true, first of all. Because under a capitalist system, first of all, what's the law of the jungle? When we talk about the stronger devouring the weak, we're talking about force, aren't we? A lion attacks an animal, kills it, destroys it. That's the range of the moment thought. That's not what happens in an economic system. We're not killing people. All we're doing is directing efforts. And if your effort is in a certain area and you're not doing it properly, or your competitor beats you out, so in the marketplace, force is, quote, of the marketplace, and there's another interesting use of the word force, because it doesn't mean the same as this. And we'll get into that a little later when we talk about economics and market forces. But those market forces are sending a message to business people that they're not doing well. Basically telling them, hey, you're in the wrong business. Or maybe you're doing something wrong. The messages are there. And too often governments want to cover up all of that by helping people out. And what happens is they don't correct the error of their ways. Because the government's helping them out and they go on with that error. And eventually the government can't afford to keep subsidizing their error and pull the plug on them. And then they're so far sunk into their error they have to backtrack a long way. So in a market economy, no one gets devoured. If someone goes down in business, I know a lot of people that have been bankrupt, that failed certain things and went on to new heights in another business. They didn't get devoured, they're still with us. They're still here. This is when we get in the world of abstractions again, because people are taking a concrete example, the law of the jungle, the strong devouring the weak, and applying that concrete analogy in a non sequitur way to an abstraction that is strictly economic. It's an economic way of describing certain things that happen in society. So these are some of the basic arguments you hear about socialism and capitalism. one of the key things that I think we have to really get down to is the difference. Why has capitalism lost? Why has capitalism lost over the last years? And why has socialism won? I mean, if everything I'm saying is true, if everything I'm saying about capitalism is true, and everything is so nasty about socialism, why is socialism winning? And again, I have to refer to my old friend Ayn Rand, who described this process for me. She says the reason capitalism is losing and socialism is winning is because socialism is being argued on a moral base, and capitalism is not. Whenever you hear people arguing about capitalism, it's always on an intellectual, economic base. It's more efficient. Yes, it is. That's not a reason to defend it. It may be more efficient, it may do a lot of things. But you see, people talk about socialism on a moral sense. Even though I might not agree with the sense of morality, people have that feeling. That saying that if you're not socialist by the time you're in your 20s, you haven't got a heart, and you're not capitalist by the time you're 40, you haven't got a mind. And that's essentially how people react to socialism and capitalism. Socialism, there seems something morally right about it, because it talks equality, it talks about no hardship for people, and that feels good. It's a feel-good philosophy, really. On the other hand, when capitalism is constantly described in terms of just economic efficiency, economic terms, law of the jungle, and all other things that get confused in with it, you don't feel as good about defending capitalism.
Socialism is like makeup.
Yeah.
Outside.
Exactly. It's a very superficial thing. And of course, we always have to keep ourselves in mind, no matter how we look, any other system besides capitalism is a system that has to read off capitalism, or whatever there is of capitalism within that system. The Soviet Union, the reason it survived for 50 years is because it had a thriving underground market. It was never recognized as part of the official free market, or any market of the Soviet Union.
Lots of vodka, though.
Yeah, lots of vodka, yeah, so people can forget
That's how
their
they
problem.
made it so many years.
But so that's the situation we have with the Soviet Union.
Also, they could look at the West, find out what we were charging for things which were discussed through market forces, and then they fixed their prices the same way. So if we hadn't been there, they couldn't have priced anything.
Well, exactly, and not only that, this came down to a lot of arguments in the later part. Everyone's worried, the Soviet Union's going to attack us. And I used to say, listen, the Soviet Union's never going to attack the countries that it depends on for its survival. It gets its wheat from it, it gets its food from it, it does all its trade. That's the only way it can survive. What is it going to do? Go and attack a country? Sure enough, that's what eventually happened. The Soviet Union's own economy collapsed. And now it needs a tremendous amount of aid to get started up again. But in any case, there's a classic example of a socialist experiment. And you'll always have people tell you, oh, but that's not socialism. That's not the pure system of socialism. Karl Marx and Lenin and the boys, they all blew it. They didn't do it the right way. And yet everything that these theories say, that the Marxist theories and the socialist theories say, the Soviet Union followed precisely. And so did China, and so did many other countries. But again, all of their systems are dependent on capitalism to some degree or other, either to some sort of underground market within their own economies, or with trade with bigger economies outside. And that's the only place the Soviet Union ever got any of its technology from, was from the West, because there certainly is no room for creativity in a country that doesn't allow people to keep the fruits of their labor and creativity. Now, getting back down to the definitions, here's a definition you get of socialism in a dictionary. Any of various theories of the ownership and operation of the means of production and distribution by society rather than by private individuals. Now, you see how misleading that definition is. Distribution by society. Well, who's society if not private individuals? Aren't we all part of society? See how dictionaries always avoid that word? They don't want to talk about government. I don't know why that is. Government and society are considered the same. It's not true. If we think about it that way, we're going to get very confused on the issues. Because the only way you can clearly understand socialism is to understand that it means distribution by government, not by little community groups that get together and say, well, how are we going to distribute the wealth this week? But by government, by force. And that's a moral argument. That's one of the arguments in favor of capitalism, is that capitalism doesn't allow the initiation of the use of force. only the retaliatory use of force, illegitimate use of force in defending individual rights. Another definition of socialism, the theory of social organization based on government ownership, management, or control of the means of production and the distribution and exchange of goods. So at least here, this was from another dictionary, they used the word government. Government ownership, management, or control. What are the definitions of capitalism in the dictionary? I've got two here. One, the economic system in which the means of production and distribution are privately owned and operated for profit. Two, an economic system characterized by private or corporation ownership of capital goods and by prices, production, and distribution of goods that are determined mainly in a free market. Well, doesn't that sound exciting? I mean, it's such a dry definition, it's really not what capitalism is all about. Ayn Rand wrote a whole book just defining it. Her definition is 300 pages long, and yet the dictionary definition is one sentence, and we're supposed to understand what capitalism is on the basis of that. So next I want to show you a couple of video clips. The first one is, ironically, both of these were recorded in 1984. And the first one is from a 60 Minutes clip. It got rather infamous, and I hope it runs okay. I just got my beta machine back from the repair shop yesterday, and this particular clip's on the beta. I noticed it was still clicking a little bit, so we'll see. I hope it runs okay. But it's, I think it was called Dutch Treat, and it's about the situation, how far socialism advanced in Holland, to the point that, I mean, some of the things that they're going to show you here are absolutely amazing. And the other clip that I want to show you is from a debate that was held at the University of Toronto. And there, they were arguing socialism on a different terms, on the moral terms. Or they're supposed to be arguing socialism on the moral terms. And debating for capitalism was Leonard Peikoff and
Ridpath.
John Ridpath.
John Ridpath, yes, Canadian. Both are Canadians, actually, aren't they?
Yes.
Originally. And they are supposedly, quote, the intellectual heirs of Ayn Rand's philosophy in her institute since she died. And they were debating a couple of NDP people. I think one was Jill Vickers. Anyway, you're going to see the names. We're going to show you the introduction and who's debating. And then I'll just scan ahead, and I just want you to hear the opening. We're not going to play the whole thing. It's a long tape. We're just going to hear the opening remarks of each of the four participants to hear how they defend their points of view. You'll hear how a socialist defends socialism, and you hear how a capitalist who understands capitalism defends capitalism. But the first clip I want to show you is the one Dutch Treat, and then we'll go to the other one. So for the moment, you can shut that down now, Robert. I'm hoping that when people in North America are watching, or originally watched a program like that, is, you know, you sit back and go, I mean, it does look attractive in a way. I mean, it really sounds like the government is looking after everyone, and everything's going very well. And it's funny that when they talked about the criticism of the system, he says, economics aside, you know, like, oh, okay, we won't worry about the economics, which of course is the bottom line eventually. Now on this next videotape, which should play a lot better since it's on the other machine, that really was the only clip I needed that machine for. We get into a different way of looking at socialism and capitalism. This is debate 84, and what I will do is just play the opening introductions, just so you know who's speaking, and just their opening remarks. I'm not going to get into the whole debate. This was held at the University of Toronto in 1984. Some of our Freedom Party members were actually there, and one of them is on the tape, in fact, the last person who was able to ask a question to Dr. Peikoff. But if anyone ever wants a copy or wants to get a hold of this whole debate, please let us know. We'll see what we can do to get you a copy. But all I will be showing is the opening introductions and the opening introductory remarks of the four main speakers, just to give you an idea of how each side defends their own self. Now, you got to be clear here. Here the issue is, which is the moral system? Because I'm sure that the objectivists, Dr. Peikoff and Ridpath, were not willing to debate it on any other terms. They didn't want to talk about capitalism on the traditional terms that we always hear about it on. what they wanted to do was establish that capitalism is the moral system, and that you should feel good about defending capitalism. So if you want to put the light down again, we'll start off with this one. And when we get past the introductions, I'll just scan forward a bit, because during that period, they're just telling everybody the rules of the debate. We don't need to listen to that particular part. So let's see how that.
Tonight, Convocation Hall is an island upon which two opposite forces will meet. They have come together here to challenge each other's principles and to defend their own in a peaceful and scholarly fashion. And I'm going to make sure. The two systems under debate are socialism and capitalism, brought together tonight for your scrutiny and judgment. The issue is morality, not economics, not history. This means that the two systems will be defended on the grounds of fundamental moral principles, not on the grounds of economic or historical statistics. This framework does not suggest that morality and economics are unrelated, but that economic realities presuppose moral foundations. The question for the evening is socialism or capitalism, which is the moral system? And in the context of this question, which of these systems justifies George Orwell's concerns for our year 1984? To your left and my right, defending socialism, are my two distinguished guests from Ottawa, Dr. Gerald Caplan and Dr. Jill Vickers. Dr. Caplan is Federal Secretary to the New Democratic Party of Canada. He received his PhD in African Studies at the University of London in 1967 and his MA in Canadian History. He was a professor of history at the University of Rhodesia and of Third World Studies here at the University of Toronto through the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. His authorship includes numerous books and articles in the fields of Canadian history and Third World politics. For 2 years, Dr. Caplan was director of the CUSO Nigeria program and returned from Africa to become senior advisor to Mr. Stephen Lewis, while Mr. Lewis was leader of the Ontario NDP. Prior to his acceptance of the position of Federal Secretary, Dr. Caplan was director of the Health Advocacy Unit of the Department of Public Health for the City of Toronto. Also, to your left, defending socialism, is my distinguished guest, Dr. Jill Vickers, feminist, socialist, and professor of political science at Carleton University in Ottawa. She is Associate Director of the Institute of Canadian Studies and National Secretary for the Association of Canadian Studies. Concerned with the rights and status of women, Dr. Vickers has written a number of books and articles on this subject, the latest of which is entitled In Pursuit of Patriarchy, A Political Theory of Sex and Power. She received her PhD from the London School of Economics in 1971, has been president of the Canadian Association of University Teachers, and was a federal candidate for the New Democratic Party in 1979. Active in the Canadian women's movement, she now serves on the board of the Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women and is secretary of the Canadian Women's Studies Association. To your right and my left, defending capitalism, are my two distinguished guests, Dr. Leonard Peikoff and Dr. John Ridpath. Dr. Peikoff is an author and professor of philosophy from New York City. He is the intellectual heir to the late Ayn Rand, philosopher and author, novelist, the creator of The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. Dr. Peikoff received his PhD in philosophy in 1964 under Sidney Hook at New York University. A native of Winnipeg, he has lived in New York since 1953 and was friend and intellectual associate of Ayn Rand for those 30 years. He has taught philosophy for 17 years at Hunter College, Long Island, and New York universities. His lecture courses on Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism are heard on tape in over 100 cities in North America. Dr. Peikoff's latest publication is The Ominous Parallels, The End of Freedom in America, and he is currently working on the unpublished works of Ayn Rand, the motion picture production of Atlas Shrugged, a new lecture series on understanding objectivism, and a new book dealing with the philosophy of education in North America. Also, to your right, defending capitalism, is my distinguished guest, Dr. John Ridpath. Dr. Ridpath is an associate professor of economics and intellectual history at York University here in Toronto. He is I'm glad to see the audience isn't split only on political lines. He is recipient of the prestigious award given by the Ontario Council of University Faculty Associations for outstanding contributions to university teaching. He received his PhD in economics at the University of Virginia in 1974. His scholastic interests are political economy and basic economic theory, with special interest in the history of individual rights, the fundamental principles of Marxism, and the history of fundamental ideas and their impact on social change. Dr. Ridpath is an advisor to the National Foundation for Public Policy Development, a new Canadian think tank, and he is a contributing speechwriter for Mr. Brian Mulroney, leader of the Federal Progressive Conservative Party of Canada. Dr. Ridpath has spoken at numerous engagements, including the Federal Progressive Conservative Party Conference of Canada and the Thomas Jefferson Institute in San Diego. In accordance with the prior agreement of the debaters, the capitalists will start off, beginning with Dr. Peikoff.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Our topic this evening is capitalism versus socialism, which is the moral system. To answer, we have to know what is morality. What is the ethical standard we're going to use to judge a political system? We cannot just assume that everyone knows or it's in the Bible. We've got to state and validate our moral views at the outset, because that's what's going to decide this debate. Now, our side holds that the standard of morality is man's life, that which man requires in order to sustain his life. Whatever man requires by his nature in order to survive, we regard as the good or the moral. Man's crucial tool of survival is his reason, his mind. The mind is our only means of dealing with reality, grasping facts, acquiring reliable knowledge. The mind is the basic source of every pro-life value. Take as one example the immense, unprecedented wealth that you see all around you in the West, the wealth created since the Industrial Revolution and capitalism. This wealth was not produced by muscles, but essentially by thought, the thought of the scientists who discovered new knowledge, of the inventors who used the knowledge to create new products, of the businessmen who used their minds to conceive and organize large-scale productive enterprises. Physical labor by itself is not what creates wealth. Every earlier age had an abundance of physical labor. What creates wealth and all human values is thought. That's point one. Morality means thinking, reasoning, exercising, and living by one's mind. Point two, life requires selfishness. A living organism has to be the beneficiary of its own actions. It has to pursue specific objects for itself, for its own sake and survival. Life requires the gaining of values, not their loss. Achievement, not renunciation. Self-preservation, which is selfish, not self-sacrifice. If life is the standard, then morality cannot consist of sacrifice. Sacrifice is incompatible with the requirements of human life. And I mean here any kind of sacrifice, whether of oneself to others or of others to oneself. Many people think our choice is only sacrifice yourself to others, which they call altruism, or sacrifice others to yourself, which they call selfishness. Cut your own throat for your neighbor's sake, or cut their throats for your own sake. Either way, however, one thing remains the same. Somebody's throat gets cut, and the dispute is merely over who is to be the victim. If life is the standard, however, we should not be reduced to haggling over victims. We should oppose on principle the idea of throat cutting, in other words, of sacrifice. A selfish man, in the sense I advocate, does not sacrifice others to himself. Selfishness means each man is an end in himself, neither sacrificing himself to others nor others to himself. A man should live independently by his own mind and effort with no victims. Such a man uses his mind to the fullest and acts accordingly. In other words, I'm talking about rational self-interest. And in dealing with others, this means trading value for value by mutual consent to mutual advantage. It means each party respecting the sovereignty and the freedom of the others with no sacrifice either way. The ethics of social service, the ethics of self-sacrifice, is what is destroying the world today. Who is supposed to sacrifice and to whom, according to the conventional theories that we hear everywhere? Are the incompetent supposed to sacrifice to the able? The parasites to the productive? Obviously no. The able and productive have nothing to gain from such a sacrifice. It's supposed to work in reverse, we're told. The able are to sacrifice to the incompetent, the productive to the parasites, the thinkers to the mindless, the healthy to the afflicted. In other words, the common denominator is the successful at living are to be penalized because they are successful, in the name of rewarding the failures who get rewarded because they are failures. You could not invent a more anti-life code of morality. And the only practical effect it can have is to strike down all who succeed at life and thereby drag down the whole human race, as you now see happening all over the world. Properly, if you are in trouble through no fault of your own, and I stress that this has to be a marginal issue. If everyone was in such trouble, the human race couldn't exist. If you are in such trouble, you have to depend on the voluntary generosity and private charity of those who are not in trouble. You have to ask for help as a favor, not as a right. You cannot use your trouble as a club over your neighbor's head. You have to recognize that other men have a right to exist too, that your suffering does not make them your slave. In other words, this is not the function of the government. What is? Well, Dr. Ridpath will be covering this point, but in essence, we hold the government's function is to protect each individual precisely from being sacrificed by others or to others, to protect the independence of each man's mind, in other words, to protect his individual rights and leave every man free to act on his own judgment and for his own profit. And this is exactly what capitalism is. And I want to stress this. Capitalism is not what we have in the West today. I'm talking about laissez-faire capitalism. In other words, the complete separation of state and economics. Not government by pressure groups, not government favors for any group, whether businessmen, labor, farmers, or consumers. Not tariff protection, nor subsidies, nor franchises, nor any kind of handouts or welfare functions. I'm speaking of government as an impartial arbiter to prevent citizens from violating individual rights and otherwise hands off, which is what laissez-faire means. Capitalism is the system that leaves man free to function. It leaves each individual free to live by his own mind and judgment, pursue his own goals, trade voluntarily with others. It's the system based on the morality of rational self-interest. Socialism is the opposite. However, socialists may protest that the individual will benefit under their system, the fact remains socialists claim that the standard of value is not the life of the individual, but the welfare of the group, whether they call it the collective, the community, the race, the nation, the proletariat. They hold that it's the duty of the individual to serve the group, to sacrifice for others, as decreed by the group's representative and spokesman, the all-powerful state. This viewpoint must mean ultimately the enslaving of the individual by the state, and therefore the crushing of thought, production, achievement, and finally of life itself. In the 19th century, when the West came closest to capitalism, the result was the highest standard of living and the longest interval of peace in mankind's history. The moral is the practical. As for socialism, look at the collapse of England, look at Soviet Russia, and remember that Nazi Germany meant National Socialist Germany. The results of socialism everywhere, am I out of time?
Yes, you are.
Are as bad as they could have been predicted. Thank you.
Dr. Vickers will lead off for the socialists.
Wow. Wouldn't it be fascinating if you came to a debate and one side said to the other, "You got me"? It's not going to happen tonight, ladies and gentlemen. My honorable opponent talked a whole lot about man. I want to start by talking about a woman. She happens to be my favorite woman. She happens to be my mother. And she always gives me good advice. Her advice for tonight was, "Jill, remember someone else washed their underwear. And remember your manners. And since you're playing the hometown team, get your thank yous out of the way at the beginning." And so I'd like to do that. I want to begin by thanking Peter for his kind introduction. I want to thank my colleagues for this opportunity to present an important issue to you. I want to thank a really super lady, Sandra Shaw, who pulled this all together. But most of all, I want to thank you for being here to listen to a debate. Now, Peter described me as a feminist and a socialist, and I'm both of those. And what I want to talk about tonight is why I think that socialism is the only truly moral system when it's built on a feminist base, and why I think that it is impossible for women in this country or anywhere else in the world to achieve with men a moral society built on the selfishness of laissez-faire capitalism. The issue we've gathered to talk about is the relative morality of the human orders involved in these two systems. I stress the word relative because morality is always a matter of human choice. If it were self-evident or clear-cut, we wouldn't need debates of this sort. I'd like us to begin by asking ourselves why the ideas which underlie capitalism or free enterprise still seem to have so much power so long after their point of creation. My honorable opponent, Leonard Peikoff, argued the case in pragmatic terms in his book. He wrote, "Historically, capitalism worked brilliantly." And yes, pragmatically, it's true, capitalism worked. But so did slavery, and so did patriarchy, until they didn't work anymore. And both stopped working historically because the moral costs involved could no longer be borne of systems that worked for the lucky few at the expense of the many who were dispossessed because of their color, their health, their age, their family heritage, or their sex. Now let me make my point as clearly as I can. Many economic systems based on moral injustice have worked brilliantly in productive terms, but all have eventually been discredited because their legitimating ideologies could no longer hide their immoral character. So it's really not very surprising that my worthy opponents will persuade people or try to persuade people of the morality of capitalism rather than its functionality. The ideas used to legitimize the activities of laissez-faire capitalism are very seductive because they express to all of us a childhood wish. And that childhood wish is that we could do what we want to do without having to even worry about hurting other people. And if only it were true, if only that childish wish were true and that there were some magic hand that would solve our moral dilemmas for us. Now, I think there's one other dimension of this seductive ideology that we have to explore, and that's the thesis that by being selfish, we're contributing to some positive good, the goal of freedom. Now, who can be opposed to freedom? Even if a small voice tells us that our dream of freedom, our childish dream of freedom, may only be achieved by a few on the backs of the many. And when we're young, the seductive lure of this call to self-interest is very clear. Come along, they say, join the parade. It's a nice parade. You too can enjoy life in the fast lane. And as a young woman, I thought feminists should demand equal rights to join that parade in the fast lane. I thought that being free meant to pursue my self-interest. There was a terrible temptation to reject those values of nurturance and compassion, cooperation, and commitment to the community which women have traditionally upheld. And I don't want to fly under false colors. It probably wasn't virtue that saved me from joining that parade. I know for a fact it was the realization that this freedom parade was bedecked with signs that said, very few women need apply. One of the most devastating effects of technological capitalism, I think, has been its numbing of the powers of imagination, especially with regard to our ability to envisage new human and communal relationships. I'm a feminist because I feel endangered by this kind of society. I feel endangered when I realize that so-called free enterprise makes billions of dollars each year out of the pornography industry, which desensitizes the men I care about, including my sons, to the degradation of women's bodies. I feel endangered by the knowledge that those in charge are willing to spend billions of dollars on weapons to defend their rights to this vaunted notion of freedom while threatening my life, my children's lives, your lives, and the very life of this planet. And it's very tempting for the feminists to say, a plague on both your houses. I want no part of this corrupt mainstream political order. But that would be a fundamental error. The point is that the ideal of socialism is not only a form of government or a manner of managing the economy. It is a way of life, of living, and of associating, which balances self-interest with concern and compassion with others. It believes with that awful old sexist Jean-Jacques Rousseau that we're a curious species, equally capable of self-love and love for others. And so I'm both a socialist and a feminist because I believe that morality requires a community capable of balancing our childhood dreams of self-assertion with our grown-up sense of compassion and responsibility with others. For me, there's no other strategy that will work, and there's no other truly moral choice. Thank you.
The second speaker for the capitalists is Dr. Ridpath.
Thank you. Capitalism versus socialism. What is the moral social system? There really are only two central issues in this debate. The first issue is to argue for the moral code underlying capitalism or underlying socialism. Dr. Peikoff has concerned himself with the issue of the moral code underlying capitalism, the code of rational egoism, and he has shown that this moral code is validated by man's nature as a rational being and by man's life as his ultimate value. I want to note that in doing this, we have not asserted our moral code, that we have gone to the pains of arguing for our moral code on the basis of man's nature. We have, in fact, done what the debate topic demands so far in making a case for the morality of our system, and I look forward to our opponents doing the same. The second issue in this debate is the application of this moral code to the question, what is the moral social system? And that is what I'm going to address myself to. In moving from the moral code to the question of the proper society for man, the first point to make is that to live, which means to use his mind and to act on the basis of his thinking, man in a social setting needs one thing: freedom. And this, in essence, means freedom from the initiation of physical force or fraud by others against him. This freedom is man's fundamental social requirement if he is to be able to live by his mind. It therefore is true that it is moral to be free. The initiation of physical force is the primary social evil. A social system built on recognizing the value of freedom is the moral social system. Any social system adopting and institutionalizing the initiation of physical force in any way for any purpose is by that fact an evil social system and an enemy of man's life. Now, let us consider the state, the government, as a social institution. What is the essence of this institution? The government is not merely a set of laws. It is not a cooperative organization. It is not like an insurance company. It isn't a charity. The government, i.e. the state, is properly defined as that social institution, the only social institution that has a legal monopoly over the use of force in society. It is society's only legally authorized social institution. Now combine this fact with man's need for freedom, with the morality of ensuring that men are free, and what do you get? You get the conclusion that the moral government will use its monopoly on force only to retaliate against those who initiate force. You get a government that seeks not to violate man's need to be free, but to protect man's need to be free. You get a government whose only morally legitimate function is to protect the individual's rights to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. You get the only moral social system that there is, pure, undiluted, laissez-faire capitalism. The principle of recognizing individual rights is our way of safeguarding man's need to be free from force. Rights protect man in his freedom to act in pursuit of his life. Rights ensure that men will be free to think, free to act, free to enjoy the fruits of their actions. Rights protect men from each other. They certainly don't enslave men to each other. Thus, there can be no such thing as rights to the property of others or rights to be the beneficiary of the unchosen actions of others. There are no rights to food, to shelter, to health, to education, and the like, precisely because such so-called rights are, in fact, coercive claims on the property and the actions of others. These rights are really a wholesale assault on the very notion of rights itself, and are remindful of George Orwell's slogans such as war is peace, knowledge is ignorance, and freedom is slavery, of which I'll have a little more to say later. The moral society, therefore, is the society where the government stands ready to retaliate when someone's rights are violated, but it never itself initiates force and violates its citizens' rights for any purpose. The proper function of the government is to supply the courts, the police, and the military. And that's it. And this is precisely what capitalism, properly defined, is. Capitalism is that social system based on the total, uncompromising defense of individual rights. Capitalism is the only social system in which all property is privately owned. Capitalism is the only such social system in which men resolve their differences and pursue their individual ends exclusively through rational persuasion, voluntary agreement, and free trade. Capitalism is the only social system in which the initiation of physical force and fraud are abolished from human affairs. Capitalism is the social system which recognizes the social needs of man's nature. Capitalism, therefore, as I said in my quote for this debate, is the only moral, productive, and benevolent social system that there is. Such a social system has never yet fully existed. In 19th century North America, it was the most closely approximated. In the 19th century, the principle that men would not initiate physical force against each other in their social relationships was more closely approximated than in any other time in human history. In the 20th century, all vestiges of this principle have been totally swept away in the altruist welfare state orgy of our times. There has never been pure capitalism, and there certainly isn't any capitalism in the 20th century. Nevertheless, we do not advocate capitalism because of our looking at the past. We advocate capitalism while looking ahead, while we're looking ahead to a free, prosperous, and civilized future. I think you can see why we are proud to appear here tonight as advocates of capitalism as the only moral system for man. Thank you.
The second speaker for the Socialists and the last in this opening round is Dr. Caplan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to join my colleague Jill Vickers in thanking Sandy Shaw and her gang for organizing this fascinating but not, as I'll tell you in a moment, quite unique evening. You now today know Sandy Shaw as a great organizer of important debates. Someday you'll know her as a great Canadian sculptor. Wait for it and remember the name. It's true. Secondly, I want to thank my parents for bringing the rest of my family for that small ripple of applause that our side is getting. I asked my 11-year-old friend Jason Moore to bring some of his kids to applaud for us, and I'm sorry he didn't, because we could have had those seats filled and it would have helped my morale a lot. But still, we're going to take you on tonight. You know, it's an important historical evening. It's not the first time, it's the second time. 25 years ago on this very stage, yes, I was in third year, and I don't know who sponsored it, David Lewis and William Buckley performed. Perform is certainly the word. David Lewis, then, as always, the great voice of socialist passion and indignation in Canada, and William Buckley, fey and insouciant, newly up from Yale, his great claim to fame, his charming and noble voice of approval for Joe McCarthy and all his works. And I want to tell you, with his wit, he gave David Lewis a run for his money that night, and I'm only sorry his successors tonight are not doing the same thing, of course. Let's, I also want to say that I'm not here in my official capacity as a paid hack of the New Democratic Party, and I say that not defensively, not because of Jim Laxer, and not because of 15% in the polls. I'm not embarrassed about it. They're difficult times, but I mean, it's my job. But I want you to know I'm here in a private capacity, even though I do get a derisory sum of money for doing that job from time to time. Let's talk about the three social systems. We've talked about two. Let's talk about a third for a second that are at the essence here. And let's talk about morality, which simply means how real people live in the real world. And I feel at some disadvantage now that now that John Ridpath has explained that his capitalism has never existed, does not now exist, he does not know when it will exist, and therefore can show categorically how it is bound to be the best system in every way. I have some greater constraints. We have a little evidence on our side that's more ambiguous. Democratic socialism is, as Jill Vickers suggested, not a narrow ideology. It began as an unbounded faith, as a vision of a great future, as almost a religion that said, this is what the human being is capable of, that there is a way of organizing our world and believing certain things that will suppress that black part of the human soul, that will elevate that best in the human soul that's not always found in our world. And that's what socialism was going to do, and we can trace it proudly from the Old Testament and the Sermon on the Mounts, all through the Diggers and the Utopians, through European history, and it's a proud tradition. And it's an ethical proposition, and it talks, well, we're in a problem here, it talks just the way they talk. It says that people are at the center of things. Now, they said that people are at the center of things, but I heard them ending up saying that property was at the center of things, that material was at the center of things, that wealth was at the center of things, not for socialism. The touchstone is people and people always, and the ends are clear, simple and clear. One is a belief in an egalitarian society, a belief in the moral equality of all human beings, and therefore a system that function that way regardless of background or regardless of each of our accidental attributes. Secondly, it's a philosophy that calls passionately for social justice, for the fight forever and forever for civil rights for groups and for civil liberties for individuals. Thirdly, it's a philosophy that calls for economic and social security, not just a larger cake, but a fairer distribution of the cake. My old Polish uncle used to talk about stomach socialism. Don't give me all your fancy ideas, he said. Unless people are full in their stomach, they're not going to be able to talk about dignity. And so socialists honed in on the welfare state and made that proudly one of the great contributions of this civilization in the era we've lived through. And finally, peace. Now, I know some of you will say that we are being self-righteous, that there are even some on their side who believe in peace. Well, there are people who espouse laissez-faire and people who espouse free enterprise, and they speak of peace, and they include the people who move back and forth between the Pentagon and the American arms movement, and they include Ronald Reagan and his trillion-dollar arms budget. I know that all of us believe in peace in the same way. I don't want to talk about communism because it's not what we're here to do. We do not believe in any socialism that is not democratic. If it's not democratic, it's not socialism. A tyrant who calls himself a socialist is only a tyrant, and anyone who thinks he's on our side or she's on our side and doesn't believe that is not on our side. But let's talk about the issue for tonight. Let's talk about capitalism. Let's say what it is. I agree with our colleagues. I agree. It's about inequality. It's about the rights of property. It's about the right to seek profit. It's about the right to exploit others in order to seek profits. It's about accepting the role of wealth and property as a gauge of power, of your power and your status. You remember a wonderful old saw from a French writer named Anatole France 100 years ago that in the sight of the law, rich and poor alike could sleep under the bridges of Paris. This is the liberty, I think, that we get from our friends. Look what they say themselves. Look what they say themselves. They've heard it here. They've written it. John Ridpath says that laissez-faire capitalism is the only social system that's based on the recognition of individual rights. Peikoff, the only alternative to tyranny that's ever been discovered. Peikoff actually says that the United States is soon going to become like Nazi Germany. Well, Ronald Reagan said last night that the United States is back. Now, what's it back to? Maybe he thinks it's back to Nazi Germany, but even I don't accuse him of that. There is a hyperbole that I can't deal with. There is a meanness that I can't deal with. There are a series of contradictions that I can't deal with. They talk about free enterprise, but every free enterprise government in the world regulates its system on behalf of business, which always and invariably benefits. They talk about laissez-faire, and they are part, hold on please. They talk about laissez-faire, and they are part of a moral majority that wants to dictate to us what we do about divorce and about birth control and about homosexuality and about abortion, and they want to interfere with our private life. They talk about liberty, they talk about liberty, and they talk about liberty. And through all the rhetoric, here's what I hear. I hear McCarthyism. I hear the problem of the Japanese Canadians. I hear civil rights in the United States. I hear the padlock law in Quebec. I hear the War Measures Act in Canada. I hear the question of labor rights. I hear the question of torture of citizens in Central America by those who talk about individual rights, and I want to tell you that the argument for them is always made by the left, and the argument for the oppressor is always made by the right. We'll pursue it later. So much for their liberty.
But nevertheless, you should be aware that Mr. Caplan still has his weekly column in the Toronto Star, where he's enunciating the very same beliefs week after week. And did you notice a difference in the approach between at least how the subject matter was being handled right away? They weren't defending socialism. What were they doing? Attacking capitalism. And first, not just by attacking it, but first by redefining it in the way they see it, in their abstract terms. All those things that Mr. Caplan said he saw. That's right.
So socialists are not capitalists. That's how we define socialism.
No. And a lot of what he was attacking too wasn't laissez-faire capitalism or capitalists' moral grounds. He was attacking a lot of conservatism, which often gets confused with capitalism. You know, Ayn Rand used to really say that one of the worst enemies of capitalism is the conservatives, precisely because they're the ones that keep defending capitalism on those, you know, really dry, efficiency type of level and not on a moral level. And because at the same time the conservatives on one part of their beliefs do believe in interfering with individuals' lives. And generally that's on a more personal level rather than economic. It can range from censorship, abortion, drugs, and all the rest of it. All the things that he said the government was interfering in.
I think in my opinion, he's talking about more like the Pat Buchanan types. You know, that Pat Buchanan is really...
Well, right. There's a lot of inconsistencies, and that's one of the things that I encourage everyone, you know, after you leave today to you know, start looking for information, start looking for this information. Get copies of debates like this, get books like this, so that you can further understand what are the critical differences between all the systems. One of the interesting things that kept coming up was selfishness versus concern for others, you know, the whole thing. Well, I've recently been arguing something very different, and that's that I argue that socialism is a selfish system in the bad sense. Because, you know, Ayn Rand, when she wrote a book called The Virtue of Selfishness. And, of course, the first thing you think this is terrible, and you open it up. And in her introduction, she says, well, the reason I'm using the word selfishness is precisely to shock you. Because what I'm really saying is I believe in rational self-interest. But because of the barrage of attacks that you get from all sorts of philosophic bases, people are confusing their legitimate rational self-interest with being selfish. Now, I draw a very distinct line between selfishness and self-interest. As Dr. Peikoff said, selfishness is wanting to live at the expense of others. Self-interest is wanting to live by your own effort. Now let me ask you, which is a selfish system, socialism or capitalism? Isn't socialism totally concerned with some people living on the expense of others? How much more selfish can we be? I can't think of a system that's more selfish than socialism when you look at it in that context. The other issue that came up was fascism. And here I just want to make another distinction in the definition of socialism and fascism. Remember, socialism is, quote, government ownership and control of the means of production. distinguishes socialism from fascism is the way that the two systems look at the institution of private property. Socialism wants to do away with private property altogether, own and control. Fascism leaves the property in the name of private individuals, but places controls on that property. And that's how you can recognize a fascist policy. Just by definition. And I know fascism is a word people don't like to hear. It's Nazi Germany, it's this, it's that. But fascism has a very definite definition. It relates to how governments control private property.
So rent controls.
Sorry?
Rent control is a perfect example.
Rent control is a perfect example of a fascist policy. That is fascism. The government is determining the rates to the private landlord in charge of his own property. Not somebody else's property, his own property. Another example, we're going to get more into these issues a little later on. Another example of fascist policy was our recent Sunday shopping law. Because there the government is telling a person who owns his private property what he can do with his property. It's very different. See, our healthcare system is socialist. The government owns and controls the hospitals. The hospitals aren't privately owned. There are some. I mean, we live in a mixed economy, but we're singling out the precise definition part so we can think clearly about the whole issue. So, I think if you look at the whole issue of socialism versus capitalism, there's much more to it. You should hear some of the retorts that came back after this and then the questions from the audience. It was a very interesting debate. And, of course, you can see how, again, and I have to stress it, socialists cannot defend socialism. They can only attack capitalism. Whenever you run into a socialist, you find that all they do is attack your values and have nothing to say in defense of his own, on moral principles. And morality counts, because when you walk into a debate with somebody and you've got the moral upper hand, and I learned this very quickly, you can win a debate very quickly. So next, it's about 10 to 12 now, and we can make a decision here. I just have one more area to cover, and very briefly, that's economics. I don't know whether what we had planned is we're going to take a lunch break sometime shortly for about an hour. And we can either come back. I just want to do one thing on economics. I'm not going to take very long to get an idea of what economics is and what it looks like we're talking like about 10, 15 minutes as long as I can possibly do that. And then we'll get to specific issues one by one and the question and answer period. So we could either do this before the lunch break, do it now, and maybe break at 10 past or quarter past. And come back. I would prefer to do that and have a break and then lunch or
And keep going.
everybody okay? Okay, let's just go on to economics. We'll there's just a couple points I want to make about economics. I'm not going to get into economics on the sense of the science of it. The science of economics is a very involved thing. You can get into all sorts of things. You can get into terms like marginal utility and all those terms that economists use to study differences and choices that we make economically. But I want to look at economics a little bit more in terms of us as human beings. What are we talking about when we talk about economics? If we look at a definition of economics, and I got this out of an economics textbook, it says basically that there are a lot of definitions of economics. One is the study of those activities which, with or without money, involve exchange transactions among people. Another says that the definition of economics is the study of how scarce or limited resources are used to produce commodities. Another one says economics is the study of wealth. One of the better definitions of economics, and I'll quote this one, says economics is the study of how men in society end up choosing, with or without the use of money, to employ scarce productive resources which could have ultimate uses to produce various commodities over time and distribute them for consumption now and in the future among various peoples and groups in society. Now, doesn't that sound like another one of those dry definitions where they're looking at economics from, again, just its efficiency levels?
Is that one sentence?
Believe it or not, yes. And that was from Samuelson and Scott, which was the university economics textbook that I've known used for quite a while. And it's actually not a bad economics textbook when it comes to the science of it, that when you see some of the premises that they'll accept about government and things like that, you can make your cringe. So some of the terms that are economic, and this is where we get into a lot of a lot of arguments about certain things. We always talk about the market, the free market. The market will tell us what the prices are. People think that somehow that the market is some nebulous force out there. We use the term market forces, right? That forces us to charge certain prices or give our labor at certain values, and suddenly we start thinking about the market like this gun here. I mean, because we call it market forces, I was down in Florida a couple of years ago, and I remember they don't have rent control in Florida. And the landlords down there complaining. Because, at least at the time I was down there, because they couldn't get as much as they wanted for their rents. There's too much competition. So they were complaining about market forces, and they want the government to do something about those forces. Isn't that natural? I mean, we can use one force to balance out the other force, right? Well, this comes down to a definition situation. What do we mean by market forces? Well, the market is us. If anything, the market is the true democracy. It's the actual result of what we choose and what we do. Those are the market forces. And one of those forces that's in each and every one of us is that we want the best deal for the lowest price possible. Yeah, that's selfish. Isn't that what everybody wants? Isn't that the same thing that socialists want? They want a low price even if it's not possible. So we have to realize that the free market, when we talk about the free market, we're talking about free citizens. Simple as that. Free from government. Citizens who choose what they want to pay and what they don't want to pay. Now, that doesn't mean that you get everything you want or that you like what you have to pay, but you still choose. The other thing is, we talk about the economy in general. What is the strength of an economy? One of the things I learned that really created strength in an economy, and that is, again, comes down to the human factor, the part you never hear about, and that's human free will. And I have found, and you find one exception for me, I'd like you to bring it to my attention, that the greater the degree that people are allowed to exercise their free will economically, the better off economically the society in which they live is. The less they're allowed to exercise their free will economically, the poorer their society is. And I think this is a universal rule you'll see constantly, and it relates to the difference between a forced transaction and a voluntary transaction. And I just want to demonstrate this on a very individual basis. Suppose we have and this boils down also to how wealth is created. You can see wealth created right before our eyes. On a simple example, here's a newspaper. Wasn't that nice? It happens to be an even cost $1, London Free Press this weekend. Now what I usually do, when the London Free Press sells me that newspaper, they want one of these. And in exchange for this, I get one of these. Now, the value of what's in this paper, or what I think about what's in here, is not to be considered in this example. But basically, we can look at this transaction, exchanging this dollar for the newspaper under two different ways. We can look at it voluntarily, or we can look at it forced. Now, here's the issue. If we have a voluntary society, every transaction creates wealth. It's not how much money is in the economy. This is the only dollar that's in my economic example I'm going to give right now. It's not a matter of how much money is in the economy. It's a matter of how much free will is in the economy. Along comes a newspaper boy. Sell me this paper. I have $1. Now, we don't consciously think about this process, but here's what's going on. If the person selling me this paper felt that this dollar, or that this paper was worth more than this dollar, that person wouldn't give me this newspaper or exchange it freely. Not freely. Remember, we're talking about a free, voluntary transaction. Or in reverse, if I felt that this dollar is worth more to me than this newspaper, which I guess in a way I do, but that beside the point, I wouldn't make the exchange either. No loss, no gain in this situation. We don't go for the exchange. But the minute I decide to give this dollar for this newspaper, what I am actually saying, and I'm not doing this consciously, we do this a million ways, and then, just millions of ways, maybe even daily, the way we do our value system. But subconsciously, I am saying that at least at the time of the exchange, I might feel totally differently 10 minutes later. But at the time of the exchange, and this is critical, I value this paper more than this dollar. And the person that accepted the dollar for the paper was thinking the same thing. He valued the dollar more than the paper. Now what that means is that we each got something that we wanted more than what we gave up. Therefore, we each gain in wealth. That is the process of wealth creation. Now, if you multiply that 2 times for 2 people, 4 times for 4 people, 20 million times for 20 million people, how many transactions can you possibly conceive of at one time? Remember, our human brains are only capable of thinking or focusing on a few things at once. So there we have a perfect example, very simple, very straightforward, of a voluntary transaction. Both people win. Now maybe I needed this newspaper just for one ad there. I really needed something important. I really didn't care about the paper. I didn't feel good about buying it, and I gave that sort of reluctantly. But I still did it consensually. Nobody forced me to. And I still gained as a result. Maybe temporarily. Maybe the person who got the dollar just gained temporarily. What happens after that is off on to the next transaction and the next value judgment. We can't start confusing them all. But now let's look what happens in the reverse case. Say we're in the Soviet Union and this is the proud of the newspaper and have to buy it. We don't want it. So I have to take this dollar that I want to keep and hand it over to somebody who's forcing me to buy their product, whatever it is, in this case, say a newspaper. Transaction takes place. This person gets what they want and gets rid of something they don't. I get something I don't want. I'm losing that transaction. And think about this. That is exactly what's happening with every single government dollar that is spent. Because government spending is forced spending. All they're doing is replacing voluntary spending with forced spending from government. And by forcing people to spend money where they wouldn't put it, they devalue what they get for their money. They devalue money, they devalue what that person gets in terms of their wealth. And I think that's something, that's basically all I really have to say about economics, because from there you can pick it up on your own. The key is the transaction forced or is it voluntary? And we have a complete education system that's financing this kind of study through secondary one, through force. And why is it then that the schools cost so much more? See, if we were privatized, people could buy what they want right away, whatever they paid. If they wanted it, it would gain in value. But the other issue is, as we all know, private education for a similar comparison to public is not even half the price. So we still go for that socialist solution. Let's get it for free, and all of us end up paying more. So basically, that's all I really wanted to say about the economy, except for one other thing, and that's profits. Profits and prices. People, socialists constantly bring up the issue of profits. One of the reasons they say that we can't have our education and healthcare system operating privately is because people will make profit at it. Indeed, and that's a waste of money. They're making money that they're given an education or they're given healthcare that only costs them X dollars, and they're making a profit on it. We've got to get rid of that profit. So that's one of the justifications they use for bringing socialized spending. Well, the issue isn't profit. Profit shouldn't concern anybody. You shouldn't care about what profit anybody makes. It's really none of anybody's business. What you should care about is prices. Prices is what comes to the consumer, not profit. Who cares how much money somebody's making? Because if you're on a voluntary system, it doesn't matter how much profit you're making in something. If I'm going to give you this dollar for something you're offering me in exchange, I'm only giving it to you because I think I'm going to gain in value. Now ask yourself this, and this is the case that I brought up with Marion Boyd when we're talking about subsidized daycare in Ontario. Would you rather, just arbitrarily, let's say it costs $500 a month for daycare for a child, okay? And let's say, would you rather pay $500 a month to a private daycare operator who's making a 20% profit? Or would you rather pay $1,000 a month to the government that isn't making any profit? Because that's exactly the way it is. The government's not making any profit, but it costs more, precisely because it's not on the profit principle. There's no reason for the government to protect its profit and its profit margin. Profits, you always hear that terrible socialist statement, people before profit. You hear that expressed in so many different ways. That is a contradiction in terms. Only people can earn profit. Everyone earns a profit. And profit comes in different names. People who work for somebody, their profit is called a wage. People who invest and get dividends, their profit is the dividend or the interest payment. It can come in very many names, but the one that's really under attack is the businessman for making a profit. So essentially, as consumers, we've got to get rid of that whole idea that profit is even an issue. We shouldn't care whether someone's making a lot of money. We should be encouraging a person to make a lot of money if they're giving us a price that we want. All the more power to them. That's what Henry T. Ford's, that's how he got rich. He was able, he made a lot of profits, he made a lot of profits, but he put the cheapest Model T Ford that every American Canadian at the time could buy, first cars that most people could get. Because somebody was making a lot of profit and gave them a lower price. So that's all that matters in economics when you're talking about the market. And this again boils down to free trade. If you have to be in favor of free trade. If you believe in voluntary transactions. Anything other than free trade is controlled trade. And who does the controlling? Government. And what does that mean? That means there is a forced transaction going on somewhere and somebody's losing. So basically, that's the only real principle you have to know about the market if you want to get more into economics and learn more about the mechanics of it and the philosophy of it and things like that. I encourage you to do that on your own, but that's all you really have to know in terms of economics for this period. So that's all I really had to say. Now, if there's any questions on anything that has come up this morning or anything so far before the break, and then what we're going to do is after we break for an hour, we'll get down to specific issues, one-on-one policy and how we would institute it. And that depends a lot on you. It may take us 1 to 2 hours, it might take us break for 5. It depends on how long you want to go. So I basically covered the bare skeleton of what I wanted to present to you today, and then we're going to get right down to the basic issues after the break. So is there anything else you'd like to mention up until this point? Everybody's happy, ready for a break? Okay, let's break for an hour. And we'll be back. It's about 12 now. Let's say 1. Let's say 1:15. To give everybody that little margin in case of